I'm Nima Rajan. Following a series of violent, targeted attacks that killed or injured Muslim Canadians, the federal government is holding a summit on Islamophobia today. The idea is to allow the Muslim community to share their ideas on how Ottawa can help bring down the number of incidents and lift Muslims out of a state of fear. Over the last year, there has been a spat of hate-motivated attacks against hijab-wearing Muslim women in Alberta, the fatal stabbing of a volunteer at a Toronto mosque, and the last month's deadly vehicle attack in London, Ontario. Meanwhile, Muslims across Canada are celebrating a somber Eid ul-Adha this week. Edmontonian Amina Khurshid said this year's Eid is a little sad because of reports of hate-motivated attacks against Black Muslim women in parts of the country. Still, she says she invited cousins and friends over for an Eid dinner and was excited to share a home-cooked meal after going so long without gatherings. In Alberta, all COVID-19 restrictions have been lifted. Well, it wasn't much of a surprise when the U.S. formally extended its travel restrictions at the Canada-U.S. border for at least the next 30 days. Officials at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security specifically cited the rampant spread of the Delta variant of COVID-19 as part of their decision, but promised to keep talking with Canada. On the flip side, Canada will relax land travel restrictions for fully vaccinated U.S. citizens and permanent residents on August 9th. U.S. President Joe Biden has nominated tech executive David Cohen to be his ambassador to Canada. The lawyer currently serves as a senior advisor to the head of U.S. communications giant Comcast and spent 5 years as chief of staff to Philadelphia Mayor Ed Rendell in the 1990s. Mr. Cohen also hosted the first fundraising event of Mr. Biden's 2020 presidential election campaign. The head of the Canadian-American Business Council is hoping that Mr. Cohen, if confirmed by the U.S. Senate, can help ease the mismatched pandemic travel restrictions between both countries. NDP ethics critic Charlie Angus says he was shocked to learn that it would take the Justice Department 6 years to provide correspondence on a new pornography regulator. Mr. Angus says the 75-month waiting period for his access to information request was, quote, ridiculous. He requested the information after the Liberal government announced that it would create a new regulator ensuring online platforms remove harmful content, including depictions of children and intimate images shared without consent. The infighting appears to be continuing within the Green Party. Court filings show party officials are looking to overturn arbitration orders that blocked threats to Annamie Paul's leadership. The move ends a brief ceasefire between warring factions ahead of a likely federal election this year. Ms. Paul recently said she and the Greens cannot speak publicly about why the non-confidence vote and membership review were put on hold until at least August 21st, when a general convention is scheduled. A BC Supreme Court judge says she won't allow a proposed new evidence on Meng Wanzhou's extradition case because it doesn't expressly support the Huawei executive's claim that the United States' case against her is unreliable. Associate Chief Justice Heather Holmes issued the ruling on July 9th, but her reasons for the judgment were not released until Wednesday. Ms. Meng's legal team argued that the documents undermine the allegations of fraud against her, showing that the U.S. misled the court in its summary to Canada of the case against her. Friday's opening ceremony at the pandemic-delayed Tokyo Games will have less red and white. Although the Canadian squad is made up of 370 athletes, the nation's largest contingent since the 1984 Summer Olympics, officials say only about 30 or 40 athletes will be allowed in the march. That is because athletes aren't allowed into the village until 5 days before they compete, so fewer Canadians will be on hand to participate. The Seattle Kraken have set their initial roster. The NHL's newest expansion team unveiled all 30 picks at a ceremony near Lake Union with Commissioner Gary Bettman in attendance. Seattle took Calgary captain Mark Giordano and New York Islanders winger Jordan Eberle among their picks. It was a celebratory night. The team will make its debut at Vegas in mid-October in a march of the NHL's two newest teams. The Kraken will play their first home game on October 23rd against rival Vancouver. A young killer whale calf was recently photographed swimming in the waters off Vancouver Island, allowing researchers to identify the young orca as female. The roughly 6-month-old calf, dubbed L125, was spotted in the Swiftshire Bank area just west of Port Renfrew. Fisheries and Oceans Canada says it was able to identify L125 as female, which was promising news for the matriarchal species, which needs more females to assist with population growth. L125 was born in BC waters in February. All right, stay with us. Up next, we speak with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation regarding a recent PBO report that finds Canada won't be able to balance the budget until 2070. We'll have an interview with Mr. Franco Terrazzano, the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, coming up next. And of course, we'll follow with more news from around the world only on Forum Daily. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after these short messages. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is calling for change following a recent report by the Parliamentary Budget Officer that predicts that the federal government won't be able to balance its budget until 2070. According to the organization, the Prime Minister had promised Canadians that he would balance the books in 2019, but supplementary data from the PBO's Fiscal Sustainability Report for 2021 finds the government won't be able to hit that mark until 50 years later. Meanwhile, the federal government is projected to rack up more debt to the tune of $2.7 trillion before being able to balance the budget in 2070. All of this does not include interest charges. Well, joining us now to tell us more is Mr. Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Hey, well, thanks so much for having me on today.
Now, the PBO report specifically highlights federal government debt, but where is Canada at in terms of our overall public debt?
Well, the federal government is already in more than $1 trillion worth of debt. And the provinces aren't doing well either. When you look at the provinces and the federal government, each Canadian is on the hook on average for about $57,000 in government debt. And really, that's why it's so important for politicians to start taking deficits seriously, to start reining in their bloated budgets. Because you know what? I don't know too many Canadians that have tens of thousands of dollars just lying around to be paying their politicians' credit card bills.
Now, during the 2015 election, the PM promised to balance the budget in 2019. So how has the government followed up on this promise?
Well, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has missed that target by a country mile. We had a big deficit in 2019. We had a big deficit last year. It looks like we're going to have another big deficit this year. And according to the PBO, the federal government isn't going to be able to balance its budget until 2070 under the status quo. That's quite frankly, it's unacceptable, and Canadians deserve better than about 5 decades of deficit spending.
And sir, before we move forward, would you be able to explain for our viewers the difference between balancing the budget and paying down debt?
Yeah, well, when we talk about balancing the budget, we just mean spending less than what you bring in. And, families get that, businesses get that, Canadians get that. We just wish our politicians would get that. And, in addition to balancing the budget, we also have to be worried about the debt. And the PBO says that if we don't balance the budget until 2070, the federal government is going to rack up another $2.7 trillion in debt, which is on top of the already $1 trillion debt tab.
Now, that number doesn't include the interest on top of that. So how much interest has Canada accumulated in its debt so far?
Well, right now, the federal government's interest charges cost us about $20 billion every single year. But if we don't balance that budget until 2070 under the status quo, then we could lose out up to close to $4 trillion in interest charges. And that's really important because that money, it can't go to healthcare. It can't go back into our pockets through lower taxes because that money has to go to the bond fund managers on Bay Street.
Now, considering prior promises to balance the books, how likely is there going to be a balanced budget by 2070?
Well, we need to see a balanced budget long before that, right? That's the PBO's projections, but that doesn't have to come to fruition. We do need to see politicians start to take all these massive deficits. We have to see them take it more seriously, right? And one of the reasons that we need to see politicians address all of this deficits is because if we don't make tough decisions now, we're going to be forced to make even tougher decisions down the road. Let's look back to the 90s, right? Let's look at the province of Saskatchewan. For years, they were kicking their debt problem down the road. And in the 90s, they ended up having to close 50 hospitals in that province. And really that underscores the point. If we don't make tough choices now, we're going to be forced to make even tougher choices in the future.
All right, sir, just about a minute left. But what steps can the feds take right now to reduce spending and tackle this massive debt?
Well, step number one is they have to reverse course, right? In that most recent federal budget, we saw Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland announce plans to increase permanent federal government spending by more than $100 billion by 2026, with absolutely no plans on how to pay for it. So what we really need to see from our politicians is to start taking deficits seriously, because if they don't, it's going to be average Canadian taxpayers that get hammered with higher taxes.
30 seconds left, sir, but what can Canadians do to voice their concern around this issue?
Well, the key thing that Canadians can do is, when we hear these politicians and their massive spending plans, we have to ask a simple but serious question. How are you going to pay for it?
All right, sir. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Well, hey, thank you so much for having me on today.
Stay tuned, everyone. We've got more top national headlines coming up after the break as wildfires continue to threaten the economic recovery in BC. We'll have that story and more national news coming up next. Well, just as the economy was getting back on track and BC's tourism industry was roaring back to life, devastating and deadly wildfires are causing havoc. But BC Premier John Horgan is promising support that the tourism industry received during the pandemic will continue. This comes as much of the province struggles with wildfire evacuations and destruction. More than 3,000 firefighters and support staff are on the fire lines trying to contain some 300 blazes. Yukon's government says with slowing infection rates and 79% of its population fully vaccinated, several COVID-19 restrictions may soon be lifted. Acting Chief Medical Health Officer Dr. Catherine Elliott says starting August 4th, people returning to the territory will not be required to self-isolate. People also won't need to wear masks in indoor public places, and bars and restaurants will be allowed to return to full capacity. Calgary police are asking for help from the public to identify suspects after 11 churches were vandalized in the city. They believe the incidents are linked to unmarked graves being discovered at former residential schools. Police say the churches were vandalized earlier this month with orange and red handprints, the number 215, and other related markings. Police say they understand the trauma being felt by the community, but say vandalism to churches could be dangerous to both the person involved and anyone inside. Shoal Lake Cree Nation members are returning home after wildfires forced the community to evacuate. Chief Marcel Head says about half of the 300 band members who were forced to leave after going home or are going home after taking shelter in dorms at the University of Regina. The air in the community is clearing, but he says vulnerable community members, such as elders and those with respiratory conditions, will stay behind for now. Livestock producers in the Interlake region of Manitoba are calling for government help to deal with the drought. Nearly 100 producers gathered for a rally west of Tulone to bring attention to the issue. Orville Proctor, a municipal councillor and beef producer, says farmers want financial assistance and more Crown land opened for haying and grazing. Ontario's opposition parties are criticizing the government for spending about $10 billion less than it had planned last fiscal year. That figure comes from a report today from the Financial Accountability Office. The NDP and the Liberals say that money could have been used to help people more during the pandemic. A spokesman for the president of the Treasury Board noted that overall spending increased by $21.3 billion compared to the previous year due to pandemic measures. A report on schools from Ontario's science table this week recommends that screening policies be updated. In both low-risk and moderate-risk scenarios, the experts are recommending that fully vaccinated people wouldn't have to stay home from school if they were exposed to a COVID-19 case. Those scenarios also contemplate dropping the requirement for students to stay home if anyone in their household has a symptom. Quebec is rejecting a $14 billion natural gas project proposed for the province's Saguenay region. Environment Minister Benoit Charette says the government is not convinced that the project would lead to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. He adds the government is worried it would discourage natural gas buyers in Europe and Asia from moving to cleaner energy sources. GNL Quebec had proposed to build a plant to liquefy natural gas carried by pipeline from Western Canada. The federal government has announced over $10 million in spending on projects to assist the seafood processing sector in New Brunswick. 20 of the 22 projects are in the Capellet area. The funding will help processors add new equipment and make changes to improve employee health and safety due to COVID-19. Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc says the projects will help the fish and seafood processing sector get more Atlantic Canadians back to work. A ship that had been anchored off the coast of Newfoundland with COVID-19 cases among its crew has left the province. The Provincial Department of Health says the vessel left the province from the Bay Bulls Harbor, where it had been anchored for several days. 4 of its crew members tested positive for COVID-19, and one of them remains in hospital. The department did not reveal the name of the ship, but vessel tracking information shows a Portuguese fishing trawler called the Santa Cristina had been anchored there until yesterday. Well, there is a strong demand for homeless shelter beds in Charlottetown this summer. Tammy Denning, the executive director of Blooming House, says there has been a rise in demand this summer for beds at the women's shelter. She says it's this time of year when homeless women may consider leaving relationships or other situations. Officials say while the men's shelter is also busy, there's no increase during the summer. More top stories from around the world coming up next as G20 environment ministers will meet in Italy. Meanwhile, Hong Kong police arrest trade union members for sedition, and more details on China's detention centers in Xinjiang province have been released. We'll have these stories and more national and international news coming up after the break, only on Forum Daily. So stay with us. We'll be right back after these short messages, everyone. Environment and energy ministers from the group of 20 industrialized countries are meeting in Naples ahead of November's crucial UN climate change conference. Host Italy is hoping the talks will help spur ambitious goals to be adopted at the COP26 conference in Glasgow, Scotland. The Naples meeting on Thursday and Friday will focus on 3 main themes. They include biodiversity and ocean protection, promoting circular economies, particularly in the fashion and textile sectors, and realigning the financial system to promote sustainable development. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is rejecting 2 Republicans tapped by House GOP leader Kevin McCarthy to sit on a committee that is investigating the January 6th Capitol insurrection. Mr. McCarthy denounced the decision as an abuse of power and said the GOP wouldn't participate in the investigation if Democrats won't accept the members he appointed. Speaker Pelosi cited the integrity of the probe in refusing to accept the appointments of Jim Banks or Jim Jordan, 2 outspoken allies of former President Donald Trump, some of whose supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Hong Kong police have arrested 5 trade union members over children's books that they described as seditious, and a court has denied bail for 4 editors and journalists that are held on charges of endangering national security. Local media reported that 5 who were arrested are members of the General Association of Hong Kong Speech Therapists. The association published 3 children books that police say have seditious intent. The books feature stories that revolve around a village of sheep that has to deal with wolves from another village. China's largest detention center is twice the size of Vatican City and can hold at least 10,000 inmates. The Associated Press was the first Western media allowed in during a state-led tour of Urumqi No. 3 detention center in Dabancheng in Xinjiang. No. 3 was converted from an internment camp into a pre-trial detention facility, the AP found, in what appears to be an attempt to move Uyghurs and other mostly Muslim minorities into a more permanent prison system justified under the law. A senior Chinese health official says China cannot accept the World Health Organization's plan for the second phase of a study into the origins of COVID-19. National Health Commission Vice Minister Zhang Yixin says he was rather taken aback by the call for a further look into the pandemic's origins, and specifically the theory that the virus might have leaked from a Chinese lab. The head of the WHO acknowledged last week that it was premature to rule out a potential link between the pandemic and a leak of the coronavirus from a Chinese lab. Iran has begun exporting crude oil for the first time in the Gulf of Oman, bypassing the strategic Strait of Hormuz. During a ceremony marking the inauguration of the project, President Hassan Rouhani called the plan strategic. Iranian state media described the move as an indication that sanctions imposed by the U.S. were being defeated. Germany's National Weather Service said Thursday that regions hit by deadly floods last week could again see heavy rain at the weekend. The death toll from the flooding across Germany and Belgium has resulted in over 200 deaths. More than 4,500 civil defense workers, firefighters, and soldiers have been deployed to help with cleanup efforts and are in the badly affected Air Valley region. Commemorations have begun to mark the 10 years since Norway's worst ever peacetime slaughter. On January 26, 2011, right-wing extremist Anders Breivik set off a bomb in the Oslo, killing 8 people. That was before he made his way to an island where he stalked and shot dead 69 mostly teenage members of the Labour Party's youth wing. Events will take place around the country today. Hundreds of workers have fled businesses in northern Haiti after demonstrations near the hometown of slain President Jovenel Moïse grew violent ahead of his funeral. Associated Press journalists saw the body of one man who witnesses say was shot Wednesday in Quartier-Morin. Fleeing people said they saw burning tires and men with weapons demanding justice for the late president. Events to honor the assassinated president will begin Thursday in Cap Haitian ahead of Friday's funeral. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says the Taliban appear to have strategic momentum in the fight for control of Afghanistan. General Mark Milley told a Pentagon news conference that as the Taliban put increasing pressure on key cities, they are setting the stage for a decisive period in coming weeks as American forces complete their withdrawal.
A significant amount of territory has been seized over the course of 6, 8, 10 months sort of thing by the Taliban. So momentum appears to be, strategic momentum appears to be sort of with the Taliban. The Afghan security forces, though, are consolidating their forces. So part of this is they're giving up district centers in order to consolidate their forces because they're taking an approach to protect the population. And most of the population lives in the provincial capitals and the capital city of Kabul.
General Milley said that while the Taliban are trying to suggest the inevitability of victory over the government forces, the Afghanistan military could still prevail. And that'll do it for your look at national and international news. We'll see you next time, everyone.